Good. Let's see if we can get the sound and the action together. This shows the bottom corner where I came from in Australia. I did my master's degree in statistics there. And then I went across to France, the École des Mines, where I made my colleague suffer so much when he came there a few years later. And I did a doctorate in geostatistics applied to coal. And it's important, the fact that it was coal, for the rest of my talk. And when I got to retiring age, you get put out to pasture. And I didn't particularly want to stop working. So I complained to everyone, and one of them said, come to Brazil. And I now work at FGV, Fundação Getúlio Vargas, in Rio de Janeiro. And today I'd like to talk about coal. So let's start out with the production of coal in the world. And can I have that mic? It's easier. Okay, is that clear? So you can see there that China over there consumes the largest quantity of coal in the world, with the United States doing a good job behind it, and Eastern Europe and Russia consume large quantities of coal, and they're going to continue to do that for the foreseeable future. Am I speaking clearly enough for you? No problems understanding my accent? Okay, good. To move? Yeah, good. And so the northern countries basically are consuming the coal, and the producing countries tend to be, well, let's start from left to right. You've got Colombia here, which produces and exports large quantities of coal. South Africa is also a major producer. Australia, major producer, major exporter, and Indonesia is another one. So that's where the coal is being produced, and that's where it's being consumed, essentially. I'd like to talk about a term which you're going to hear more and more about over time. Social license to operate, usually abbreviated SLO. It refers to the willingness of people, particularly stakeholders, the local community, to accept the inconvenience of extractive industries, mining, quarrying, and of course, oil and things like that. I'm sorry this isn't clearer. This image came from Reuters, which is a leading news provider and a very reliable one. This is not from some sort of left-wing NGO or something of that sort. So we're looking at the Las Bambas copper mine in Peru. The photo was taken about a year ago. What you see in the foreground there. Okay, I'll tell you when you're. So here we have a coffin. Someone died. He was killed by the police because he was demonstrating. These are all of his colleagues. You can see those characteristic hats of Bolivians and people who live in the Andes. These people were protesting against the inconvenience of the copper mine because it produces too much noise and too much dust. So one person died in the demonstration there, and the previous year, 3 people died in the demonstration. They were all variously killed by the police. So you can say that in this area, there is a major problem of acceptance of the mine. So we've had a look at social license to operate. It has mainly a local impact. But what I want to talk about now is the social license to finance, and that has a worldwide impact. By this, I mean society's lack of willingness to allow certain types of operations, mining operations, particularly coal, to be carried out at all. And the way that they're cutting it is by cutting the funding. Thanks. So this is the main points that I want to talk about today, to show how concern about greenhouse gas emissions and climate change in general has resulted in international banks refusing to finance projects. Come back to this in detail in a minute. Socially responsible funds, particularly pension funds, have disinvested, and we will see that in some detail. The G20 nations, that's the main financial part of the world, set up a financial stability board after the collapse in about 2007, 2010, and that group has set up a climate change task force. And we are looking at changes in the way the multinational mining companies are starting to deal with coal. Most of them are offloading their coal things. Next. Thank you. And last, and changed since last year's presentation, our dear friend Mr. Trump has withdrawn from the Paris Climate Agreement, as you know. But 27 governments have joined a new alliance called Powering Past Coal, and that was about 10 days ago. So this is a very new development. We will look through those things in more detail. Okay, so the end result of this is that in the future it's going to be very difficult to finance coal projects at all. The usual sources of funding have simply dried up. And this has happened in the past 2 years. And let's see what's happened in detail. My colleague Gally and I were amazed at how dramatic the changes have been and how fast they've occurred. The coal mining finance situation has completely turned itself up on its head in 2 years. So what happened when I started to become aware of this? In France, every year for the past 15 years, I've been running a course at the School of Mines, and the course is called Project Finance, non-recourse funding. It's a very big project. The minimum size would be normally $50 million, and they run up to hundreds of millions of dollars when you're looking at gas on the Northwest Shelf in Australia, gas and oil projects, big infrastructure projects. And 2 years back, my colleague from Crédit Agricole said, because he knows I'm Australian, he said, oh, and you can forget about the funding for that coal deposit in Australia. No one's prepared to put money on the table. I didn't know what he was talking about. It took me a while to find it on the internet. But he was right. They're just not going to get the money for this new, huge development of coal projects. You don't have that much coal mining in Brazil, but you have a lot of mining in general, and this feeling against mining could well move to a whole series of things. For example, the rejection of the tailings dam for storing waste. After the Samancor disaster, you could see people saying, well, if there was another one of those disasters, we just don't want it at all, thanks. Now, let's go back to the Paris Agreement, which is about 2 years old now. In December 2015, 195 participating countries, including the US under Mr. Obama, and even China, but not Russia, agreed to hold the increase in the average global temperature to well below 2 degrees. I think you all know all about that. I won't go into too much detail. And they decided that it would be better if they could keep it below 1.5 degrees. And they had another point B, to increase the ability to adapt to adverse impacts of climate change, foster climate resilience, low greenhouse gas development, and so on. And the last one, they said they wanted to make financial flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. And that's what I'm going to talk about mainly. Firstly, there has been a reaction by the international banks involved in project finance to refuse to finance coal, sometimes all coal and sometimes just thermal coal. You know that there are two uses, main uses for coal. Coal can be put into power plants, and then it is called steaming coal or thermal coal. Or it can be sold to people who are running the steel industry, and it's put in the blast furnace for making steel. Two different uses, quite different prices for the product, and quite different quality control on the two. So going back a bit, a group called Banktrack found a much more efficient way of biting the coal system. Look at the picture on the right. That's typical of the pictures you get when non-governmental organizations, NGOs, are opposed to coal or to anything else. They show an emotional photograph of something that you wouldn't like to happen. And then they go on to say that coal is horrible and bad and it's causing all of the problems. And most of the mining companies have got to the point now where they say, so what, so what, so what, it's the same old story. But Banktrack came up with a much cleverer way of protesting against this. They realized that attacking the mining industry itself was of a limited efficiency, but that if they attacked the banks that were financing it, they could cut the money off. It's a very inventive way of dealing with the situation. So let's see how much money is required to finance just coal. This one shows you the top coal mining, 20 coal mining banks in the world, the accumulated amount that they had spent between 2011 and 2013, middle 13. The scale here is from 0 to 500 million euros. So the top one up there, I'm not sure whether you can read it, Morgan Stanley, in that period had loaned out over 4,000 million euros. The one at the bottom, Goldman Sachs, had only loaned out 1,100 million euros. You can run the sum yourselves. You can see that this is thousands and thousands of millions of euros. Who's involved? Morgan Stanley, Citibank, a Chinese bank, Bank of America, another Chinese bank, Royal Bank of Scotland, the French bank BNP Paribas, Chinese Development Bank, JP Morgan, Standard Chartered, which is British, Barclays is British, Deutsche Bank, so that's German, UBS and Credit Suisse are both Swiss banks. Then we get the Japanese coming in, HSBC, another Japanese bank, and Goldman Sachs. So it's not one part of the world, it's all over the world. So then I looked at their figures for Australia. Well, looking at the bottom one, you can see the main coal measures, the main coal areas. And these blue dots show the ports through which the coal is exported. Up the top, you can see the banks listed down here and in hundreds of millions of Australian dollars. The green lines are the lending and the black lines are what are called underwriting. So we have Credit Suisse, BNP Paribas, then a series of Australian banks, Commonwealth Bank, an Indian bank, JP Morgan Chase, an Indian bank, a stack of Australian banks, and the Japanese at the bottom. So why are we seeing the Chinese, the Indians, and the Japanese? Go back to slide 2. Who was buying the coal? Who was burning the coal? Okay. This is the ones who are involved in loaning to coal ports. just the export facilities. Australian Bank, Australian Bank, Australian Bank, British Bank, Indian Bank, Australian, Japanese, French, and the Development Bank in Singapore. And you can see these sorts of amounts in millions of euros. So the amount of money that these people are involved in is absolutely enormous, and Backtrack clearly had found the right way to tap on them. Oh, sorry, we're going backwards. This is how they do it. They put a lot of pressure with beautiful pictures like that, and they make the banks feel uncomfortable by sending people. They get their members to go and buy shares, and then you can go to the shareholder meeting and ask awkward questions. It's singularly efficient. So these are the banks which have now promised to do things in a better way. Bank of America, BNP, Citigroup, Crédit Agricole, Morgan Stanley, Société Générale, Wells Fargo. So these banks have published policies with financing exclusions or reduction commitments at the sector level for coal mining companies and coal-fired power stations. Other ones have agreed to restrict the project finance for coal-fired power plants or prohibited the financing of producers which use mountaintop removal for coal. In the United States, when they're taking out coal in the Appalachians, the area is hilly and they simply take the top of the hill off. They drop the hill into the valley next door, which does wonderful things for the water system. And some other banks have proposed less serious things. So that was 2015, and things are moving on. Let's have a look now at what is happening to the pension funds. So we've seen the banks. The next big source of money is pension funds. You know, you will know that most of the Brazilian pension funds are in deficit. They've got problems. They invest money. They hold it for 30 to 40 years while you young guys wait to get to be my age, his age, when you want to take the money out. And so these have got to be long-term investments, and mining investments were one of the good things that used to work very well for long-term investment. In June 2015, the Norwegian Parliament voted to divest $8 billion of investments in thermal coal, including the following amounts. This is a British utility company. That's another one. These are European ones. Duke and Peabody are American ones. They also got rid of 12 Chinese companies, 8 Japanese countries, and 5 Australian companies. So this was a major sell-off of investments in coal projects. And one of the parliamentarians said, investments in coal are both a global warming risk and a financial risk. Before I go on, you know that the Norwegians, when they hit oil in the North Sea, decided that they would not spend the money now, that they would save their money. They were a very poor country with farmers and fishermen, and they are now excruciatingly wealthy. It's difficult for me to buy a McDonald's hamburger there. It costs so much. And they put all of the money into their pension fund. Pension fund in 2015 earned so much money that it earned more than the Norwegian government budget spent. Okay? So it's very well invested. It's very carefully invested. It's very ethically invested. It's one of the nicest pension funds to watch in the world, and everything is transparent. So they are saying that it's a global warming risk. Okay, that's fair. And a financial risk. So let's see what they're talking about there. Oh, the others who got rid of things. AXA, the big French insurance company, offloaded 560 million. The Germans did the same thing as the Norwegians. The DC pension fund in Washington has decided to get rid of everything that's fossil fuel, coal and oil and all of the rest of it. In California, they ordered the 2 state pension funds to get rid of coal. So this means that a lot of people who had a lot of money in coal won't touch it anymore. The Guardian said keep it in the ground, and they put pressure on the UK universities, which had very large foundations behind them, that is savings that they've got. So they've got the University of Kent, Lincoln, Cardiff, Manchester, Sussex, Ashton and Goldsmiths in London to agree to offload all of their coal investments. Student protests did the same thing for Oxford, Edinburgh, London School of Economics. King's College held out for a while until its former student, Desmond Tutu, sent in a protest letter, and then they offloaded. Come back to the question, are the coal investments really risky? This graph shows a series of things from 2010 to 2016. We start out at 100% in 2010, and this line is called the S&P 500. It shows the average level of shares in the New York Stock Exchange. So on average, they went up from 100 to 125. They went up 25% in the 6-year period. What happened to coal? They're talking about Dow Jones US Coal Index, which went from 100 down to about 10. So if you had invested $100 there, your take-home value is 10. Happy? Hands up those who are happy with their investment. Okay. Now, no, don't be shy. Put your hands up. Good. It's a disaster. So this means that anyone who is investing for pension funds or something like that is not going to get into that type of investment. You can't talk to your policy holders and say, well, you know, we like coal. It's a great thing, but it's just gone down by a factor of 10. So it really is a hassle. Why has this happened? Well, we've had a series of things in Mr. Obama's presidency which limited what you can do with various parts of the coal. You've got problems about mercury and toxic air problems, source standards and coal combustion residuals, which they were dumping all over the countryside and often have heavy metals and other nice things in them. Let's go on with a little bit about whether these things are a financial risk. We have the Arch Coal Company. These things are arranged in alphabetical order. Arch went into Chapter 11 bankruptcy the beginning of 2016. Alpha Natural, Chapter 11 bankruptcy, but came out. Patriot went in, Peabody went in, Walter Energy went in. So how bad is the situation for people who had money in those things? Well, Arch Coal said, we believe we are well positioned for a quick and successful restructuring under Chapter 11. We intend to emerge a stronger and more competitive company. But unfortunately, we do not expect existing Arch stockholders to receive anything. Okay, so if you were a shareholder, now your money's worth zero. And they then talked to the people who were their retirees, whom they had been paying benefits to. And they said, we fully expect to continue providing retirees with their usual medical benefits. The cash balance pension fund are paid from a trust that's outside the assets of the company. So there will be no change in the value of your benefits. The fact that it was outside the company means that they couldn't get at it and take it away. But they said, unfortunately, those of you who invested in the deferred compensation plan are not protected and you won't get anything back.
if you were a retiree from Arch Coal, how would you feel having worked 40 years underground in difficult conditions to be told that you won't get anything back? We're enthusiastic, aren't we? And they were. So they started what is called a class action. This is a legal procedure against Arch Coal and Peabody Energy to say that they hadn't behaved in the right way, that they had breached their fiduciary duties for the employees' pension funds, and the plaintiffs, that is the pension people, the retirees, asserted that anyone who had anything in his head would have offloaded Arch and Peabody stock and found something else. And that was what happened in the old days with Enron. Enron went bankrupt and all of its retirees ended up with nothing because they had everything in Enron stock. Let's go down to the third one now, the Financial Stability Board, which was set up by the G20 countries. So it was set up in 2009. It's responsible for global financial stability at central banks, supervisory agencies. It develops standards and codes for good practice. It has surveillance and monitoring of international domestic banking systems. And surprisingly, in 2015, it rushed out and set up a climate change task force. And what has this got to do with financial stability? It seemed to me such a strange thing to do. The task force is headed up by Chairman Bloomberg. If you know anything about finance, you will have heard about Bloomberg terminals, Bloomberg television, and things like that. This is very much in the center of finance. So this guy isn't some left-wing extremist. He was the mayor of New York for a long time, and he has 4 vice chairmen: Denise Pavarino from Bradesco, a guy from Unilever, a guy from the French insurer AXA, and a lady, this lady here, from the Singapore Stock Exchange. So he's succeeded in getting, as Professor Johansson said, gender equality. The person who was interested in setting up the climate change thing was Mr. Mark Carney, chairman of the Financial Stability Board and governor of the Bank of England. So he's the governor of the Bank of England, the head of the Bank of England. This is not a well-known job for lefties. He's not some sort of NGO head. And he said that they're worried about the impact of climate change on insurance companies, that losses from weather-related events have increased by a factor of 5 since the 1980s. And he said, and these are his exact words, if the challenges posed by this rapid increase are not addressed correctly, it could cause stability problems to insurance companies. That means they could go bankrupt. That is unpleasant. This is what they're worried about. This was what happened in the northern United States, that whole area there from the bottom through Washington, New York, up to Boston, Bangor's the edge of Maine there, was completely destroyed, or large chunks of it on the coastline were destroyed. You find houses in that sort of state. Under buildings, it looks like that. This is total destruction, and that used to be a fun fair. How much are the insurers going to pay? How many times are they going to pay to rebuild the things? So in the United Kingdom, the people who take care of regulating insurance companies did some work, and they worked out what would happen if the temperature increased by 2 degrees, 4 degrees, and 6 degrees in things like the average losses per year, the 1 in 100 years loss, the 1 in 200 years loss, and the amount that they would need to have in extra capital just to cover that. So this means that the insurance companies have to put £1,000 million I think a pound must be worth about 5 reis at present, something like that. It's a lot. Multiply by 5 and you've got it back into Brazilian currency. And he went on, Mr. Carney, to say that the IPCC, that is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, had estimated how much global carbon we could burn. They call it the global carbon budget. That would likely limit global temperature rises to a maximum of 2 degrees. And this budget amounts to 1/5 to 1/3 of existing coal and oil and gas reserves. So this means you could burn, let's say, 1/3 of the coal reserves that are now on the company's books. And if you burn the remaining 2/3, the world gets too hot. So these, the vast majority of reserves become stranded, that is, you can't sell them, and they would be unburnable without expensive carbon capture technology, which alters the economics of the fossil fuel things. And the bit that he's worried about is that the UK investors, particularly the insurance companies, these liabilities could be huge. So if the insurance companies, which are taking care of pension funds in Great Britain, invest large amounts of money in things which are about to disappear, then that's a worry for the British government. Oh, sorry. And then he said, only 1/3 of the world's biggest 1,000 companies are providing enough disclosure to investors about the potential impact of carbon pricing on their businesses. When companies which are listed on a stock exchange send out their annual report, they are legally required to warn investors about things that might be unpleasant, unfavorable for the company. They have to put it in writing. And he's saying that only 300 out of the top 1,000 companies are talking about it properly. That's worrying. And a group called Ceres had a look at those coal companies and had some very unpleasant things to say about their annual reports and the lack of sensible information. And this got to the 2 groups in the United States which started to take action. Firstly, the New York Attorney General had a go at Peabody Energy and forced them to change the statements they make in their annual report. They picked on Peabody Energy, not because it's worse than the others, but because it is simply the biggest. You pick on the biggest one, fire at that, and everyone else gets the message. And then the Securities and Exchange Commission put pressure on a lot of them to indicate future reductions in projected demand for coal, because Peabody had said demand for coal will go up, will skyrocket, and you will all become very rich. The Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, is also investigating ExxonMobil. ExxonMobil is the biggest oil company in the United States. So they pick on the biggest coal mining company and the biggest oil company, and everyone else who's smaller gets the message. And they said that they would have to put better climate change disclosures, and the New York attorney sued them, calling for a lot of information. Now let's look at what the coal companies are doing in reaction. Some of the multinational mining companies are selling their coal assets. So we have Anglo American sold its 70% interest in a metallurgical coal to this sort of fund management, and its Callide thermal coal assets to someone else. Those are all in Australia, those assets. Rio Tinto, a few months later, sold its thermal coal assets to a Chinese company for $2.4 billion, and its CEO said the sale is consistent with the company's strategy of reshaping its portfolio to ensure the most effective use of capital. That's blah, blah. What he meant to say was, we don't want to be in coal anymore, thank you. We take our money and go. Not everyone is selling all. BHP Billiton has taken a different approach. In 2015, it demerged. That is, it split itself into two different companies, and the shareholders got proportional amounts in both companies. So on one side, it kept its core assets inside BHP Billiton. That is long life petroleum, copper, iron ore, and coal basins, maybe potash. And it created a second company called South 32, which it gave all the rest of the stuff that it really didn't like. And the shareholders of BHP got a pro rata share of both companies at no extra cost. So this shows where the things are that they're keeping. This is the Northwest Shelf. That's the gas up there. That will be the iron ore. Western Nickel went. They've kept these ones down here. That one they had to keep. You can see it. And the ones that they don't like, they've offloaded the stuff they had in South Africa and some Australian things and a couple of things down here. Now to our favourite friend, Mr. Trump. You know that Mr. Trump has been very enthusiastic. He was very enthusiastic about coal when he was getting elected. And not surprisingly, having been elected, he decided to announce that he would withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. In fact, he told people that he would get them to renegotiate it, and 194 other companies which had signed the agreement told him to get lost. I think France and Germany and the UK told him to get lost very quickly and in very clear terms. So we now have a small sort of problem there. And despite his withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, a whole series of governments, 27 of them, have joined a thing called Powering Past Coal. That's the week before last. This is the list of companies. It's led by Canada and the UK. These are the countries that have joined. And these provinces, what's particularly interested is the states of Oregon and Washington State in the US have also joined, despite Mr. Trump. So let's conclude now. Up until 2 or 3 years ago, the pressure to stop coal-fired power plants mainly came from NGOs and the scientific committee, but Banktrack and a few other NGOs realized that you could put far more pressure on the system by attacking the banks and the financing of coal, and they very successfully got banks to stop financing coal. They got most of the pension funds, the big ones, particularly the Norwegians, to divest. The FSB started a climate change task force. The Securities and Exchange Commission and the New York State Attorney are pushing for clearer declarations in reports to shareholders. So that is, in 2 or 3 years, we've had a complete change in perspective. I think the situation was summed up very clearly by the chairman of AXA, French insurance company, who said, over the past 2 years, the carbon risk debate has shifted from specialist NGOs, think tanks, and corporate responsibility circles to activist investors, and now to the G20 and the Financial Stability Board. Financial is no longer seen as the enemy of sustainable development, but rather as a key driver of the shift towards a low-carbon economy. Finance is part of the solution. And then he said it, the bit that is really important. In any case, we have no choice. 2 degrees, a plus 2 degrees world would be insurable. Plus 4 degrees would not be. That is, insurance companies cannot survive in plus 4 degrees. Cheerful, isn't it? Not too much to worry when you're my age, but at your age, this might be a real hassle. So there are a series of questions that remain to be solved if we're getting rid of coal. developed countries are moving towards renewable energy and natural gas rather than coal for electricity generation, electric vehicles, and all the rest. But what about developing countries? Places like India and China. In India, about 1/3 of the population do not have electricity. And if you want their kids to do their homework at night, they need to be able to turn the light on. That is a reasonable request. So we're going to need to provide these people with electricity, and it's probably going to come from coal for a long time. What about the steel industry? Steel industry requires coke for blast furnaces, and saying that you can recycle is not going to provide enough for the development in the future. So this situation is a sea change in the coal mining industry, one that my co-authors would never have expected. As I told you at the beginning, I did my doctorate on coal. I thought it was going to be there for longer than it is. You should be asking questions like, could these rapid changes affect other parts of the industry? And as I said, what would happen in Brazil if there was a second tailings pond accident? Or if a large number of people died in protests in Peru, as we've seen.
Thank you, Professor. Questions? No. I have one, Professor. There are some data about the improving of production of coal in India. Okay? And the last numbers say or show that in 1 year of growing the production, this gradient of growing of coal production in India offset 10 years of efforts from Europe for emissions in CO2. Okay? And the idea is to go farther and farther in this way because they have half of population completely out of the, let's say, system. Okay? And do you think that this changing that the north of the world is pushing, it means the insurance problems, the risk will be sufficient to dismiss or to cut this kind of evolution in co-production in the world? We know that China now is changing a lot of things. They are producing 3 billion of tons per year, okay? But they are changing a lot of things, gasification, and trying to cut high ash content mines and sulfur grades and so on. What do you think this north and south paradox, where the south is pushing more and more for coal, and now the north, we could see Angola and some other countries that they have apparently no coal. But what do you think about this paradox? These two speeds, different speeds on.
Yes, I agree with you. Okay. I can see the problem. I don't see a quick solution to it. You can't turn around and tell half of India and half of China that they can't have electricity. But if you've seen photographs of Peking in the last few years, you were lucky to be able to see from one side of the road to the other. And this is clearly causing massive health problems for the Chinese. It causes massive health problems in Korea, where my son lived for 3 years. There were times when you couldn't go out. You couldn't take children out to play in the street. It was simply not allowed. So there are problems there on the pollution side and the health that have got to be solved. You've got big problems getting in large quantities of renewable energy, solar panels or the wind things. In Germany, the European Union, the wind energy in Germany is in the north and the requirements for electricity are in the south. So they'll have to put in 1,000 million euros worth of high transmission lines from the north to south to get the electricity down. And that's a massive cost. So yes, but I see the problem, but I can't see anything that we can do but keeping going in that direction. If you, how much of Brazil will disappear under the rising water? There are whole countries that are going to disappear, and soon. So you can't just turn around and say, oh, it's more convenient if we keep burning coal in the way we used to. It's either gasification or liquidized fuel beds and those sort of things, and huge quantities of scrubbers on the chimneys and cleaner ways of getting rid of the stuff. Yeah, we'll have to change. That is, I mean, if you guys want to walk around without a gas mask. More questions?
Years ago, I had of geostatistics in USP, São Paulo. All right. Could you say to us what is the proportion of steel and energy contribution of coal production in the world? That's right.
I don't know. The steel metallurgical coal is a relatively small amount, but it's a very high value product. I think it will survive much longer than thermal coal.
And as far as I know, we can get rid of this coal to make steel.
Not yet, as far as I know.
Right.
But if we could get rid of a lot of the steaming coal, then the air would be better. We'd have a lower greenhouse gas emissions.
And what is the contribution of coal in the greenhouse gas emissions?
I think it's one of the big ones. I don't have figures in my head. Do you have some numbers?
No, I wanted you to say me.
No, I haven't tracked that.
Because those numbers are really important when we are having a speech like that. To show the real impact of coal, if you want to burn coal in the financial aspect.
You're right. Those are what I would call ecological questions for NGOs. And I was coming at it from a completely surprised point of view because I had never expected the finance industry to move so fast against something. Your point is well taken, though.
And another number I wanted to know is the contribution of the coal-based energy in the power matrix nowadays in the world.
I think it's about 50%.
So how do you expect that we move from 50% to, let's say, 10% in a range of, let's say, 20 years, maybe?
At great expense, with great difficulty. But on the other hand, if you guys want to be able to breathe somewhere along the line, we're going to have to do some of those things. I lived in Europe for more than 35 years, and at the beginning there was no renewable energy. And now countries like Germany and Spain are dominantly renewable energy. So there have been big changes. How you can do that all over the world, I understand that the cost of solar panels has dropped by a factor of 10 or 20, which makes the solar panels then a very useful sort of thing for generating it. The cost has gone down so much. It doesn't require the same subsidies as it used to. So there may be a real chance of doing that.
And just another quick question here is, well, companies like Anglo American, as you said, moved out of the coal business, and they are doing movements in the aspect of putting their bulks together, like coal, iron ore, and nickel, for example. They are all in the same management inside the company. Is that movement to make value, or to try to make value from coal, mixing with steel, or with the iron ore to make steel, or something like that?
I don't know. I don't know what's happening there. I haven't tracked that in closely for a while. It's clear that they will be doing things like that to add value to shareholders, or to add perceived value to shareholders. Sometimes companies that have had gold and something else have uploaded the other thing because gold had a higher appeal on the stock exchange. Don't know. Next.
Okay. Oh, that's the last one.
Okay, well, thank you for those interesting and well thought out questions.
Just to congratulate the Grêmio fans this morning.
Yes.
This last thing was not allowed, okay? But no, my compliments for Grêmio, okay? Yeah. Okay, Professor, thank you very much. We will have now 5 minutes, okay, break, okay, to arrange to the next part of this event, that will be the debate between the students, okay, and we start in 5 minutes, okay.